However, economic success and the enhanced political prestige that goes with it has changed the geopolitical context in which China operates. In the 5 years between Copenhagen and Paris, China's place in the world has changed dramatically. While Europe and the US suffered from economic stagnation, the Chinese economy grew by a factor of 2 actually in 8 years from the time of the Great Recession. It has become the largest economy in the world when measured in purchasing power parity. In 2017 or 2018, in nominal terms, it will overtake the United States. But right now, in purchasing power parity, China is the biggest economy in the world. Today's China can no longer maintain a low profile. At Paris, it had to take the lead, but in keeping with Deng's advice, China did aim to do something big, and what is more, it succeeded. China played a decisive role in COP21 in leading the global community to its historical agreement on combating climate change. At a crucial point in the lead-up to the negotiations, it committed itself to a major reduction in carbon emissions and set the bar so high that other countries were either inspired or shamed into following suit. China also took the lead in financing the climate change actions to the poorest countries in the world, those most affected by drought, floods or rising sea levels. This initiative, amounting to over €3 billion, smoothed the way for the global agreement, and it is clear, to use a phrase of Karl Marx, that China was the midwife of history in Paris. China's new leadership role did not come as a big surprise to me. Having long studied the culture and history of China, and having done business with Chinese companies for many years, we built 27 wind speed measuring masts in Inner Mongolia in 2004 and 2005, and I can confirm that they have cracking wind speeds up there. Could supply the whole of China actually if they covered it in wind turbines, but and they probably don't have our lot from the Midlands to object to it either. Indeed, in the past 5 years, I've been predicting that this is precisely what would happen. Having grown phenomenally over the past 4 decades, China has restored its political prestige and resumed its role as a global economic player. And at COP21, it used that political influence and economic muscle to great effect. It did so not only in creating a new international order based on cooperation and mutual respect, but also in pursuit of its own goals. It so happens that these two coincide for a very clear reason. China is a semi-desert over 60% of its landmass, insofar as and that's mainly in the west of the country, insofar as the evaporation is greater than the precipitation. In contrast, the eastern and southern parts of China are incredibly fertile and depend on the great river systems of the Yangtze, the Yellow River and the Pearl River. These rivers irrigate the vast plains to the south and to the east, which gave rise to the phenomenal population growth of the Han people in the first place. And they emanate from the Himalayas, or the mountain chains close to the Himalayas and adjacent to Tibet. This ecosystem makes China particularly vulnerable to climate change because the hot, moisture-laden winds from the Indian Ocean deposit their precipitation mainly on the Hindu Kush, on the Kunlun Mountains, on the Himalayas, and there they form into great glaciers, which are the source of all the great rivers. And herein lies the real threat of global warming, which could trigger the following chain reaction. Global warming is interfering with the accumulation of glaciers on the Tibetan, Himalayas and Kunlun mountains. The temperature rise in these mountains, and it astounded me when I heard this, is 6 times higher than it is in the plains below. Glaciers are beginning to melt and to retreat. This could affect their ability to irrigate the lands of the south and east of the Chinese subcontinent. And this is the core of the threat to the foundation of Chinese civilization. Most of Chinese population derives its protein from vegetables and fruit. These amount to some 56% of the daily protein intake. Vegetables alone make up 39% of consumption in China. So any threat to the irrigation system, which produces this protein, has the potential to reduce China's ability to feed itself, and so undermine the very foundations of the civilization over 3,000 years old. And this is why the Chinese government has got real about climate change. Arguably, it is the country under most threat from climate change, and the government has responded with intelligence and decisiveness. A 900-page report published around the time of COP21 showed the temperature in China had already increased by 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that explains the Chinese zeal to find an international solution and to devise a domestic response to global warming. It doesn't really matter where in the atmosphere you put in your CO2. You know, if it's not put in China, well, it could be put in India, it could be put in America, it could be put in Latin America. One way or another, it mixes with the rest of the gases in the atmosphere. And so China had to find a global solution to what was a global problem, but one that affected them more than anybody else. The intentions of the State Council, the Communist Party and the People's Congress were outlined in the 11th five-year plan and elaborated in the 12th five-year plan, on which I lectured at the Institute of International and European Affairs some 5 years ago. The plans indicated that China would do something that had so far evaded the European Union and the United States, and that was to introduce an effective emissions trading system and thereby put a price on carbon. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on this, when the United States was trying to curb its sulfur dioxide emissions, SO2, they were causing a lot of the great rivers and lakes in North America to be polluted with acid rain. They introduced a system of trading in SO2. So it absolutely worked in doing away with that menace on the North American continent. So if we could do the same with the price on carbon, we could actually change human behaviour. A carbon price that truly reflects the environmental damage caused by burning fossil fuels would be a game changer by progressively pricing coal, oil and gas out of the market and replacing them with renewable energy. This is why the emissions trading scheme was so vigorously contested in the European Union by the coal lobby and by big oil. And that's why carbon pricing is detested by the coal lobby in the United States, led by the Koch brothers, who fund the biggest super PAC and thereby finance candidates opposed to restrictions on the use of coal. And of course, big oil is even more powerful in America than it is in Europe, and it's pretty powerful here. Now, it's well known that coal plays a predominant role in the production of electricity and cement in China. As a result, China is the world's largest emitter of carbon. According to a recent study reported in the journal Nature, about 3/4 of the growth in its global emissions of carbon between 2010 and 2012 came from the burning of fossil fuels and cement production. China's response prior to COP21 was to pledge to peak emissions by 2030 and to curb carbon intensities by between 60 and 65% below the 2005 level. This is a credible undertaking when China says it, because as early as 2011, China had set up pilot carbon trading schemes in 7 locations, following Deng's dictum of learning by doing. In a former lecture that I gave on the Chinese planning system, I pointed out that things are tried out at city level, they're tried out at provincial level. If they don't work there, well then they're killed. If they work there, they're taken to provincial level. If it works there, it's taken to national level. Extremely sophisticated, advanced type planning that I haven't seen examples of anywhere else in the world. And based on the experiments that are being carried out in this trading system, which started, for instance, in Shenzhen, with 640 firms working there with the local government. And they will eventually, as a result of these 7 experiments that are being conducted, they will implement a national carbon trading scheme next year. As I said, the aim is to have emissions peak in 2030, but many observers believe it will achieve this goal earlier, perhaps even by 2025. Indeed, a new alliance of pioneer cities was announced last September, which intend to peak earlier than the national goal. And at this stage, I might as well say that this is where the real progress in the world is coming. It's coming from the cities that we live in, where there's very little of the conservatism that happens when you mix in, all the rural type areas, and you see the Lord Mayors of all the big cities in America, and indeed same going on in China, and they're coming together and they're setting standards for themselves that actually far exceed the national standards. So there can be no doubt that China is on track to launch its national carbon market in 2017, which will be almost by definition the largest in the world. The market will use a cap and trade system, with 80 industries obliged to either reduce emissions themselves or buy credits from others who can do so. So you can either reduce yourself or pay somebody else to build, for instance, wind farms or solar installations. And so you can buy the credits from them. One way or another, you actually contribute to reducing CO2 emissions. The petrochemical, power, chemical, construction material, non-ferrous metals, steel, paper and aviation sectors will be covered by this market. And that's pretty well the major emissions emitters in the economy. Companies within these sectors that consumed at least 10,000 metric tons of coal per year between 2013 and 2015 will be given mandatory emissions reduction targets. Specific quotas will be issued later this year. Now, I don't mind the fact that it took a year longer. They said they were going to introduce this scheme in 2016. I think it's significant that the learning that's leading to its introduction next year will build on everything that they've learned by doing it and trying it in various cities, various provinces, various industrial sectors, and it'll come together, I'm certain, for next year. The success of the scheme will, of course, depend on the caps to be placed annually on emissions. Obviously, if these are too lenient, there will be insufficient downward pressure and people won't have to do things, so there'll be no change of human behaviour and the carbon price will be too low. To be effective, I estimate that the price on a tonne of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will be $20, compared with around $30 per tonne, which was thought to be the correct number for Europe. I believe the Chinese will succeed in doing it simply because their meritocratic bureaucracy is professionally equipped to devise an effective scheme, and because policy decisions of this magnitude, uniquely in China, are obeyed and are implemented. And just by way of not apropos of this lecture, but can you think of any other economy that could actually promulgate that there would be a one-child policy and have that accepted by 1.3 thousand million people without revolution? This is extraordinary what can be achieved in this country, in this great country, when you have the cultural foundations that are there to do this, that you obey the dutiful and the righteous overlord in that economy. The Chinese way of doing things will ensure that the emissions trading scheme will work. Its success, of course, will encourage other countries, and we expect that other countries will follow suit. And as I've argued these past number of years, will lead to global emission trading systems. We need to get there. And I believe it will even happen in the United States. Hopefully. It follows that if the use of fossil fuels is progressively reduced, that renewable energy has to be expanded at the same pace. The Chinese plan is to have 15% of its non-fossil fuels, generation from non-fossil fuels, 15% by 2020 and 20% by 2025. As an integral part of its Get Real approach to renewables, China is introducing a green dispatch approach to the power sector based on the guidelines which will require grid operators to first turn to the least polluting source of power, which is wind and solar. These two technologies are mature by now and are cheaper than coal. My company, Mainstream Renewable Power, is building power plants in South Africa. The price of new coal there, which is one of the cheapest coal producing countries in the world, making electricity from that, is R1.29. Now, in the last round of bidding there, which we bid and won wind plants, we were 0.62. So we're less than half the price of new coal in South Africa, one of the cheapest coal producers in the world. So renewables has arrived, and I want nobody to be in any doubt about that. We're not looking for subsidies anywhere anymore. In fact, I think it's disingenuous of those guys who want to get rich quick in our industry to say that we need subsidies. We don't need subsidies. If you're building for a future and you're looking at coal or gas versus solar or wind, you win with solar or wind every time on price. And of course there'll be no charges for carbon pollution in the future. It's important in this context to note that China has the world's largest installations of wind and solar. By the end of this year, it will have 120 gigawatts of wind power and 43 gigawatts of solar, along with 320 gigawatts of hydro. Now, earlier on, one of our Chinese colleagues asked me, was wind power falling in price? And I said it was. A Deloitte report published in December, actually, said that wind had fallen in price by 61% since 2009, and solar had fallen by 82%. So, very dramatic things happening in our space. According to the Global Wind Energy Council, China now accounts for about 1/3 of the world's installed wind energy capacity. And according to Bloomberg News, this year alone, China will install 20 gigawatts of wind and 15 gigawatts of solar. Now, this is a lay audience, you're not highfalutin engineers. So that's 20,000 megawatts of wind and 15,000 megawatts of solar in 1 year. This is a phenomenal amount of new energy. And to give it a context, the total installed capacity in Ireland is 8,500 megawatts. And last year, we managed to install 224 megawatts of wind. So China's going to install 20,000 megawatts of wind and 15,000 megawatts of solar in this year. It's obvious that the transition to a low-carbon economy must include the decarbonisation of transport. And here China has led the way as well. It's well in its way to becoming the world's biggest producer and consumer of electric vehicles. Electric vehicle sales in China are set to top 220,000 units this year, with the US at 180,000 units, with total world sales of 600,000. China is promoting the use of electric vehicles through the combination of free parking and registration, insurance subsidies, carpool lanes, and access to highways on days when pollution is so bad that normal fossil-fired vehicles are heavily restricted. Electric vehicles only make sense, of course, from the green perspective, if it's powered by electricity generated from renewable sources. And they play a dual role in not just reducing emissions, but in acting as a giant storage system as well. Storage is key to the future of our industry, because obviously the sun doesn't shine at night. And self-evidently, wind comes when it comes, and there's nothing we can do about dialing it up or changing the direction of storm fronts or whatever. So a backup technology is needed if you want to deploy wind and solar extensively. So one of the great challenges ahead in our space is to devise cost-effective storage systems in order to ensure continuity of supply. In this regard, I would say that in Shenzhen, I believe that all taxis are required to be electric vehicles. Shenzhen, of course, for those who are familiar with this, would recognise that Jiang Zemin came to Ireland before he was the president of China. He had a look at the way we did things with our Shannon. Shannon was farthest away from Dublin. It was the most capitalist. It was nearest America. It had lots of transport to America, and least influence from Dublin. It had special tax-free status. So, in fact, in China, he replicated that by taking Shenzhen and making it into a special industrial zone. And for those of us who've been there, it's a very interesting place to go. It was a town of 75,000 people. Now there's at least 10 million people living there. And electric vehicles have a role to play because when the car is not in use, they can be plugged into the grid, not just to be charged, but to store electricity and interact with the grid and feed it back to the grid when needed. So it's an interactive, living as, totally in the now system of electricity, and that's what's going to happen to our electricity industry. And this will be a feature of so-called smart grids, whereby all electric devices are linked together in real time so as to balance supply and demand. China is developing smart grid technology and the supergrid based on high voltage DC. And to my mind, that's an indispensable component of trying to get renewables as the 100% way of making electricity. The transformation of the power system is well underway. Fossil fuels will be phased out as planned, and renewables will become the only source of power. So let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, with the following. By now it's obvious that China has restored itself to its place that it occupied throughout most of history. I saw a programme on British television there recently. During the Tang dynasty, China accounted for 50% of the world GDP. Amazing story. I won't say when we were eating one another, but when we were at a very low stage of civilized development, they were building cities which were laid out in grids. You know, I wonder where we got Dublin and London from, but they were laying out cities in grids in the Tang dynasty. That's about 800. In other words, 1,200 years ago. So China is now a global player politically and will be by far the world's largest economy in the mid-century. It faces a unique threat, however, from global warming. The ecosystem that has sustained the civilization for millennia is endangered by a consistent rise in global temperatures that is particularly severe in the Himalayas, the source of the great river systems and the basis of China's food production. China's response to this threat has been in keeping with its long-established system of governance based on getting the best people to run your country. It plans to phase out the use of fossil fuels and replace them with renewable energy backed up by measures to increase energy efficiency and by, of course, the reorganisation of its economy. It has every chance of success because of its meritocracy and the way it runs its government. There's a huge intelligence about those who run the country at national, provincial and city levels, and this is superbly organised and managed. It's a great comparative advantage that China will have in competing with the West. And I say this to anybody who cares to listen to me, actually, that there's a massive opportunity coming down here for those who can develop the green economy first. And I can see no alternative to China at the moment in terms of who's going to lead this, because it's not wedded to anything that worked in yesterday's. They don't play yesterday's tunes. They don't drive to the future by looking in the rear-view mirror, except in important ways that they preserve their culture, which is the most precious element, I believe, that China possesses. I believe that China will succeed in the task it has set itself, both to the benefit of its 1.4 billion population and for the rest of the global population. It has got real about renewable energy because it had to, because there's no alternative to the transformation to a low-carbon society. We either succeed or the civilizations that we've got used to perish. And I believe we will succeed and that China will lead the way in saving the planet and its peoples. So that concludes what I want to say to you, and thank you very much indeed for listening.